Welcome to week 2 of single entry strategy with
Solo ship.
All right, solo ship with JMtoWin and Squirrel Patrol. I'm Squirrel Patrol. JMtoWin. How was your week 1?
My week 1 was fine. I played 3 rosters, none of them cashed, but felt really, really good about one of them. One of them was super plus EV, and it was my worst roster in terms of results, but I'd play that roster 100 times out of 100. It was a Herbert-focused build that just had a really unique stack, and then a couple of Mahomes rosters that bubbled, but weren't my favorite rosters anyway. So, no harm, no foul there. But what about you? How was week 1? I know you won. Got second place in that live final last week. So shout out for that. Shout out to Big T for taking down first place. Big T, friend of RotoGrinders, former RotoGrinders contributor there. So pretty good weekend for you. How was NFL?
It's good. Yeah. So it was great. I finished second place in the FanDuel baseball live final. Then they had the NFL kickoff just the 2 days later. So there's the final was Friday. Of course, the week 1 kicked off on Sunday, and nothing like a live final to give you a lot of confidence, right? So I know from past experience, I gotta consciously cut back on the bankroll that I want to play, right? So I thought I'm gonna enter a bunch of qualifiers, but I gotta be really judicious. But I entered 2 of the DraftKings football qualifiers, and I took down one of them. Be in New Orleans, and then Monday night my flight was delayed. So I was like, well, I'm gonna enter one more qualifier. So I took that down too.
No way.
Yeah, I already got two seats to New Orleans. And of course I then entered a bunch last night and didn't win.
Well done though.
Yeah.
Good first week. Love it.
Good first week. Gotta consciously take the foot off the accelerator, right? Because as soon as you feel like you can't lose, you're about to lose a lot.
Yeah, confidence in DFS can be powerful for a little while, and then it can be dangerous after that.
Yeah, and then you start thinking wow, I'm gonna start piling money into these high dollar contests, and those can go awry very quickly. So, I
think one of the great things about when you're winning like that is you get so much more fearless with your play, and obviously you're already a fearless player, but it just you feel so much more confident and in the zone and willing to be I trust myself on this. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. And you kind of get this. I remember the year when Beep I'm a Jeep won 4 MLB qualifiers in 4 days. It was back to back days. You're in that zone where you're I'll take this risk. Who cares? I'm already up. This is house money. And then once it turns fast.
Yeah, and that's the whole art behind DFS is you're trying to find players that can still do well, but not the obvious plays that everyone's going to play, and it's that mix. And when you start doing really, really well, there's 2 things that can happen. One, you can think, well, I'm just so good at projecting these guys. I'm just going to play my highest projected players. And those are the same guys that everybody else has. And you end up playing too chalky. Or what you're saying, the opposite can happen where, no matter who I pick, they're going to win, right? No matter what lineup I put out there, I can throw any players out there. Just the guys I love off of gut feel, and I'm not going to play any of these clowns that other people are playing. And then you end up with, in last place. None of these players were highly projected for a reason.
Question for you. Did you last weekend on the main slate, was that a single entry build?
It was a 5 entry DraftKings qualifier.
Okay, so not too dissimilar from what we talk about in this show. Do you mind me asking what the roster was on that one?
I have no idea. I remember following it at the time. I was in first, and I remember I was waiting, hoping nobody else would catch me. I know I had Justin Jefferson and Travis Kelce, and that the fact that I still had those 2 guys going in the afternoon games, and I was in first place. Some people I think had Saquon, and they were chasing me, but I had such a big lead that even Saquon doing really well wasn't enough to catch me.
Yeah, that's a guy with 50 plus qualifier appearances. You don't even know what roster you had.
Yeah, I do want to say that I think the defense was pretty different. I think it was the Steelers' defense, and actually,
great play there.
I played a pretty good amount of the Steelers' defense because they were pretty cheap and and low owned, and that that game against Cincinnati helped me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is an interesting spot to talk about this week as well for defense special teams, that same team in the Bengals and how to handle that. But yeah, always good to kind of think through like how do we put together these rosters where they're high enough upside, super sharp, but different enough to get us to first place. And I think there's a lot of interesting ways to do that this week as well. I don't know if we'll get to any like week specific things here today, but yeah, I mean, the finding those like unique combinations where I think that one of the things people make a mistake on in single entry play is like we've said this before, but like either going too chalky or going so far off the board, right? And a lot of times you can play, like if you flip through the almost all game changer rosters, but like flip through the game changer leaderboards last week or any week, single entry, 212 entry max. And a lot of times it's just really sharp plays top to bottom, but just put together uniquely, put together in a different way than other people are putting them together.
I think this is an interesting week for a few reasons. There's like, I wrote down like 5 sentences of notes. Like one of the first things I wrote down is there's games that it's a struggle to find anything. Like it feels like a smaller week than a 12 game slate because there's some games that I really just want to cross off entirely. Like there's the Cleveland Jets. I don't know if I'm gonna maybe write that down for the highest scoring game of the week because I can't find anything from that game. And there's I think Pittsburgh, New England as well. I could see maybe like a Pittsburgh or New England defense and like maybe trying to pick from the running backs. That seems like it's not going to be a winning play. And so there's games that I'm like interested in just crossing off entirely.
Well, I think that one of the problems, like I think we should focus on that because one of the issues people run into in single entry, I think, is what they like about having lots of entries is they feel like they can pick and choose a lot of different players. And they also have this concept that, oh, well, if you have 150 rosters, you just print money. The truth is, if you have 150 rosters, most players would just lose money more quickly because you have to build really sharp rosters and know how to build 150 in such a way that it's plus EV to do that. But with single entry, it's like, oh, I can't narrow down my player pool that much. And so there's a tendency to hear something like Jets in Cleveland and then be like, yeah, but Nick Chubb could do this, or Kareem Hunt could do this, or Elijah Moore could do this. And it's like, yeah, absolutely. Every game there's players who could do this. But what we want to find is which players give us, like in single entry, we don't necessarily need to take on the Elijah Moores where the game total's low and the offense probably won't hit. We want to find these guys who, when people look at your roster, they're like, even if it's spots where at first glance they're like, I don't get this, but over time it's like, oh yeah, no, this play could hit, this play really could hit, and they have a pretty high likelihood of hitting. We can get a sharp player pool in single entry. Like, how far off the board are you typically willing to go in single entry, especially if it's like 2,000 or fewer entries, 1,500 or fewer entries, which is what a lot of these single entry contests are?
So yeah, there's no reason to go that far off the board. And actually, one of the things I like the best about the 1 week season write-ups is that you talk about like there's a difference between a player could go nuts and you have to have him on your roster. And in single entry, like Damian Harris could get 2 touchdowns. That doesn't mean you have to have him. Like, I mean, it doesn't mean he's, maybe a guy you can think about, but like the chances that you're going to, like Ramondre Stevenson's there too, right? So like, that's probably not a good play for single entry because the chances you need to have him on your roster to win are very low, no matter, even though like there's a difference. Like he could go crazy, like he could have a great game and you need to have that guy on your roster. And so like with single entry, I was actually looking this week and I think there's going to be some very popular players because like David Carr is too low priced on both FanDuel and DraftKings. And then it's so easy to just pair him with Devontae Adams because, that's such a strong connection. Adams had such a big week 1 and he's so much cheaper than like Cooper Kupp. And I love the idea of like doing a like differentiating based off of salary and going to like Cooper Kupp or maybe at the running back position. Like I think everyone's or I think Saquon Barkley will be very highly owned. But you can go up to like Jonathan Taylor and suddenly you've got a whole different like salary construction. So you can actually get different with safer plays. Like you can get different by going to Cooper Kupp instead of Devontae Adams. Now the issue is that trade-off is, you're gonna have to have some guy that's much cheaper. So maybe that's where the risk comes on. But I'm surprised that I think the Raiders offense is going to be very, very highly owned in both cash games, which is justifiable this week. But in single entry, I think David Carr and Devontae Adams are going to be probably over-owned, even though I think they're the best plays of the week.
Yeah, and on top of that, the Carr, Devontae Adams, Greg Dortch is going to be, I think, super popular because it started the week, early ownership projections. I'm seeing Greg Dortch at like 1%, and he's popping in every projection model you look at, and he's projected at 1% ownership, and everybody's going to see that. Everybody's going to see that if Devontae Adams is having a good game, it increases the likelihood of the Cardinals passing a lot. It increases the likelihood of Dortch piling up targets. And it's just this play is going to gain steam throughout the week to where even this whole block of players, it's like one of the things I like to do is find a block of players where, for example, you could bet on, instead of just Darrell Henderson, a Darrell Henderson bet this week is essentially saying Rams score a lot of points, Rams score a lot of touchdowns. Well, if the Rams score a lot of touchdowns, you can actually complete the Darrell Henderson bet by adding Matthew Stafford and a pass catcher, right? And so you complete the bet that way and lower your Darrell Henderson ownership. But in the case of Carr and Adams and Dortch, I think that the whole block is going to be so popular that you just have this big chunk of salary that you're moving up and down the field with, as opposed to differentiating anything. And to your point, you can go up to Kupp, and then you could throw Waller in at tight end. So you get kind of that leverage off of Devontae Adams. Waller's not going to go totally overlooked, but it's like, okay, if Devontae is not hitting his highest end range, but the Raiders are still hitting, well, now you have somebody who's getting those points, taking them away from Devontae Adams, and you get a unique construction there. And I think there's other value this week too that can differentiate you from the field. So super, super interesting week from that standpoint. I like what you said about, Carr, Devontae. Yeah, they're great plays. We shouldn't sit here and argue against that. And it doesn't mean you can't play them if you're doing something really uniquely somewhere else on your roster, but that's a very clear spot where you can just separate from the field. And even let's talk like combined price. Sure, Kupp is more expensive than Devontae Adams, but if you talk about Stafford plus Kupp versus Carr plus Devontae Adams, you're spending so much salary either way, right? That the extra, what is that, 400 plus 1,300, extra 1,700 that you're spending for this other pairing. I mean, it's not that big of a deal in the overall scheme of things. You take Juwan Johnson at 2,500, and all of a sudden you freed up salary to go different directions in other places.
Yeah, well, actually, I kind of woke up in the middle of the night last night, and I had this thought, because it takes me a while to remember football, DFS, and all the different nuances and things you can do. And it occurred to me, what if Devontae Adams is spectacular, and he just gets what if his connection with David Carr is really, really good? And and Adams sees 15 targets, catches 13 passes, whatever, 200 yards, two touchdowns, but that's it. That's the entire Raiders offense. You actually don't necessarily want to be playing David Carr and just play Devontae Adams. just play Adams, and you've got the entire Raiders offense, and you pair him. Could I pair Devontae Adams and Darren Waller with a cheap running quarterback, and get two rushing touchdowns from my quarterback and all of this Raiders passing offense that could potentially go nuts. And it's an interesting single entry thing I was thinking, where I'm not arguing with the narrative or arguing with the Vegas lines or anything, where I do think the Raiders will put up points, but can I capture those points in a different way that gives me just a little bit more points than the other rosters in a single entry format? So it's at 2:00 in the morning, I was making a Geno Smith, Devontae Adams, Darren Waller roster. I still didn't have enough money.
I think that we see that a lot, right? Adams and Waller and Renfro had 75% of the Raiders targets last week, and we're probably going to keep seeing that, which, by the way, I've got Carr, Adams, Waller, and Renfro on one of my two Mastiff rosters. So I'm feeling pretty good about how concentrated that offense was in week one. I just bet on the whole offense and hope you get all the points. But that typical thinking of the auto stack or the auto bring back allows us to think a little more deeply into things and say, what other ways could this play out? And like you said, just because of how concentrated that offense is on or might potentially be on Devontae Adams, just because Adams is putting up a monster game, even at his high salary, doesn't mean that Carr is putting up a had to have it game. I always like to actually, and you can do this different ways. You can do it with projection systems or just working through the numbers yourself. But I always like to work through the raw numbers and say, like, what is this 35-point game from Davante Adams? What are the numbers there, right? Let's call it 11 catches, 130 yards, or up to 27 points with the bonus, and a touchdown. That's 33 points. Let's give him 2 touchdowns. That's 39 points. Well, if Adams has 120 yards and 2 touchdowns, does that guarantee that Carr's going for 300 plus and 3 or more touchdowns? No. Like, he could still have 280 and 2 touchdowns, and Adam ends up being this monster play and Carr doesn't. Like, I wouldn't play that the other way around, probably. Like Carr, bet on Carr having a monster game and Davante Adams isn't involved, right? And you get other pieces, but unless you're talking large field play, but single entry, you can think through these situations. And what I love about that is it's harder for most people to take those steps because they don't necessarily trust themselves well enough to do that. But once you start thinking about the actual raw numbers, you start realizing, oh, okay, this is actually one that makes sense. To flip that around the other way too, one that I think is interesting this week is you can play Stafford without Kupp because there's other weapons, and Kupp is so high priced that, like, him having a 1-point game, like, Stafford can still put up 325, 3 touchdowns, and Kupp has 125 yards and a touchdown, right? Kupp's not had to have it, but Stafford probably is the highest scoring guy in that range of quarterbacks with that type of game. And so, yeah, thinking through the other layers and not just getting locked into the first thought most people will have can really, like, allow us to build intelligently different rosters instead of idiotically different rosters.
Yeah. I've got Cooper Kupp tagged as like one of my guys this week, just because I think Darrell Henderson's going to be so highly owned. And I think it's a week where everyone kind of agrees on who they think is going to be the highest scoring teams, but there's like too much certainty about how those scores are going to come, and people are like, well, everybody watched the Rams and Bills, and it was like all Darrell Henderson, and that was a big surprise. Like, one of the biggest surprises, or like, for a lot of people, one of the biggest surprises of week one is that, like, Cam Akers seemed to, like, he was totally out of the offense, and Darrell Henderson was the guy, and he's really cheap. But he's not necessarily going to get all the scores, and, like, he's not necessarily going to catch a bunch of passes. Like, he might have 80 yards and no touchdowns and 2 catches, and even at his salary, like, he's kind of a bust. So I like the idea of, like, what if, like, Cooper Kupp had a tremendous game and nobody's talking about it and nobody wants to roster him, and it's a price thing. But, like, what if he caught 2 touchdowns instead of 1 and 13 catches? I mean, and he just seems to be the whole offense, and I think he's good leverage off of, like, Darrell Henderson. And you also, like, what if they do want to get Cam Akers more involved? I don't know. I mean, and maybe I'm just, like, clinging on my Cam Akers, like, season long team, but I think there's just too much certainty. I was thinking about that in the Denver game as well. Because I think the Broncos have a pretty high implied point total, but I think everybody likes Russell Wilson, and now they're going like Jerry Jeudy and Sutton. But, like, what if it's just Javonte Williams, like, running Houston into the ground? Again, if that game's not particularly close, like, why wouldn't Denver just keep running the ball against the Texans? And Javonte Williams is a guy who would, well, it's tough to pick the Javonte games from the Melvin Gordon games. Like, Javonte's a guy that can go absolutely berserk and break off 70-yard runs.
Yeah, the ability to think, like, outside of the salary structure can become so valuable because we can get very value-based in our thinking since we're playing a salary cap game. And so it's like, well, Kupp is a worse play than Davante Adams because he's 9,900 and Davante Adams is 8,600. But then if you think about the difference in salary, 1,300, and even if we just multiply that by 4x and call that 5 points, right? Like, Kupp could it's just variance that Kupp could very easily outscore Davante Adams by 5 points. And then all of a sudden he's the better point per dollar play in that scenario, let alone he can outscore him by 10, 12, 15 points. And that extra salary spent, becomes really well worth it. And even if it's a difference, that extra 1,300 doesn't kill you, right? Like, Adams outscores Kupp by 5 or 6 points. It's not like Kupp's going to bomb. And so now you're still kind of even with everybody else, but you have a different salary structure than everybody else. So it forces you to maybe pay down at a place where other people aren't, and you end up with some sort of value that other people are not on.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of ways to differentiate your rosters, and like even before the season, I kind of know like week 2 and week 3 are the weeks where everybody thinks they know what's going on now, right? Like, oh, okay, we had some surprises last week, but now we know exactly what's going on. And I think you're going to see some of the highest ownership numbers that you see in single entry this week, with so many people being so certain about like David Carr, Devontae Adams, and I think I look at the same thing, and it's like it's hard to break away from that. And maybe we are spending a 10,000 on Devontae Adams by the end of the season, and he's just this year's guy that's just going to be peppered with targets. And like David Carr is way too cheap. Like I think on FanDuel he might be closer to the bottom of the of the quarterback salary list than to the top, or he's like in the middle. I think he's like 7,300. And the Raiders have one of the highest implied point totals, so it's going to be hard to break away from that. Just starting that kind of roster construction. You said like Dortch as well, just fits right in there. But like Dortch is a guy I was watching like the RotoGrinders live show on Sunday, and they kept talking about him, and I had no idea who he was. I had no idea. I got to go look at like who's this Dortch guy they keep talking about. Like, some guy on it, and it made sense. Like Rondell Moore was out. I'm like, I had no idea who he was. An hour before I was putting him in my rosters. So there's clearly some paths to failure there as well as like paths.
Right. I mean, he's a 24-year-old. He was undrafted. He's 5'7". He ran a 4.59 40 time. He's been on practice squads his whole career. Right. So if he's 2% owned this week, great. If he's all of a sudden 12, 15% owned, it's like, well, you guys do realize there are still ways that this play could fail, And so, it's an interesting week for sure. And I think that one of the things I've highlighted this week is if there's a blip on the radar in terms of usage in week 8, we all are sharp enough to say, oh, well, this is a one-time thing. But if it's week 1, we're like, okay, so this is how this offense is run now. If somebody were the focal point of the offense in week 8 and they hadn't been the focal point all season, it's easy for us to write that off. But if it's week 1, we're like, okay, so this is how this team is running things now. Now we know, and now we're certain about this moving forward. So in a week like this, are you more interested in moving off of popular plays to find other like super sharp plays within like regardless of salary range? Or are you kind of looking for ways to just allocate salary differently than the field? I mean, it's interesting because we'll probably get a lot of people pay down at one running back for Henderson, pay up for Saquon or CMC. You could pay up at 2 spots, or you could pay down at 2 spots, or is it more just about the players that are going to stand out to you?
I like this kind of week because it's true. Like, what people's rosters are going to look like. There's going to be a lot of rosters that look the same way. And if that ends up being what you needed to have, then it's just not my week. But I think about things that can happen that are different than what people expect. And then I build a roster based off of that. And so like 2 things that are in my mind are that Arizona could score more than Las Vegas. So you could have like a Kyler Murray, not a Dortch roster, and maybe even Kyler Murray just paired with Devontae Adams and Waller, and see, can I still build a decent team? And then another thing that I think could happen is I think the Rams could outscore the Raiders, and that game's actually the game that you want to have. And because I think their implied point totals are about the same. And the Rams, we might see like angry Matthew Stafford, right? Or like angry Rams. And like, what if they just go absolutely berserk? And like tight end is an interesting position this week because there's no Travis Kelce on the main slate. And I love playing Travis Kelce. Like he's probably the player I'm most overweight on in my DFS career because I think he's such a different player at the tight end position. But I like the idea of actually running that Rams game back with Kyle Pitts because he actually doesn't need to do that much. Like he could actually get there in a Rams stack without scoring a touchdown because there really are not a lot of great tight end options. So I try to see what are other people going to do. And this week, more than other weeks, I think you have a more clear picture of what a lot of rosters are going to look like. Then what can happen that's very feasible that makes that roster not the winning roster, and like what rosters can I construct that are then the winning rosters based off of those things that could happen.
I love that approach, and I love the way that you put that together because it's basically saying, I'm going to still take great plays. No, like it could just as easily have been, if the narratives had developed differently, it could just as easily have been Stafford and Cup. Maybe Cup's priced 700 cheaper, and it could just as easily have been Stafford and Cup who became the chalk guys this week. But it's like you're still playing sharp plays, but you're also not just playing sharp plays in a vacuum. You're saying directly, like, what is everybody else doing? And what are the actual bets that they're placing, whether they realize it or not? Like everybody who's loading up on Devontae Adams and Carr and Dortch, they are placing a bet that says this game plays out exactly the way Vegas is predicting. The Raiders end up winning. The Cardinals kind of score some points, but they don't push the Raiders too much, but they push them enough that they keep passing deep into the game. And so what's another way that game could play out, and how do I benefit there? Or what's another way other games could play out that would kind of vault it above that game? And also, you've mentioned Jonathan Taylor, you've mentioned Cooper Kupp, and I think that that's important to recognize. Your qualifier win, Justin Jefferson, Travis Kelce, players who can put up top of the slate scores, not just good scores, right? Top of the slate scores, like, and sometimes these guys come with more floor than other times, right? Like last week, I emphasized Derrick Henry on my rosters where other people were emphasizing different high-priced running backs. Well, his floor is way lower than some other high-priced running backs, but his ceiling is just as high or even higher. And so finding these guys who they're not just getting you a haul of good points, but making sure you're identifying there's only 5-6 guys on any given slate who could truly break the slate at the higher end of the price range, and saying like, well, if I'm not getting the high-end guys that everybody else is on, who are the high-end break the slate guys that I do want to get? Because those are the guys who probably end up vaulting you to the top of the tournament.
Exactly. Yeah. People try to get different by finding that player that nobody has heard of, right? The Greg Dortch going into week one, where, oh yeah, nobody's even heard of this guy, and he's going to be the guy that breaks the slate. Like, well, no, like sometimes the guy that breaks the slate is the guy that everybody's heard of, but only 10% of people have, because he's too expensive and he doesn't fit that perfect, like Devontae Adams build that everybody wants to have because it seems so obvious. Yeah, there's actually a lot of players this week who you can spend up, and it might mean you have to sacrifice Devontae Adams, or it might mean you have to pair him with Adams, but then you're going really cheap. But I kind of like that idea of maybe you're just differentiating with salary, but still staying with very, very solid plays. And you don't necessarily, that's the beautiful thing about single entry, is you don't necessarily have to find that one diamond in the rough. And like, you don't necessarily need to pick between the two Patriots running backs, because even if one of them does score 2 touchdowns, that's not the guy you have to have. But like, yeah, I could see Cooper Kupp being the guy you had to have, or Jonathan Taylor being the guy that you had to have, or and I think McCaffrey will be popular. But like, yeah, he puts up those multi-reception, rushing yards, receiving yards games where that's the guy you had to have. And maybe Devontae Adams is the guy you had to have, but like it's not, like, I think his ownership is going to be too high for that possibility.
I want to also touch on defense because I think it's important this week, especially in single entry with the Bengals, and the assumption that Cooper Rush is just going to be so bad that the Bengals should be 40% owned. Whereas obviously the Bengals are going to project as the best defense, but they're not going to be the best defense on the slate 40% of the time. There's 24 defenses. That's what that's every team has a 4% chance starting out. And maybe the Bengals bump up to like 7, 8, 9% chance to be the best defense this week. What are some ways? Because there aren't really other cheap defenses that stand out as really sharp plays. So then it's like, oh God, I'm spending an extra 1K in salary or 900 in salary to get to one of these other defenses that I feel good about to be different. So what's kind of like your thought on a situation like that?
Yeah, I love it when a defense like the Bengals is going to be very, very highly owned, just because the scoring is so random. So I like the Bengals could have a great defensive game and not score a lot of DFS points. Actually, I like Ezekiel Elliott a little bit this week. It makes me a little uncomfortable. But if you play Elliott and he gets 2 touchdowns, and the Bengals, that destroys a ton of rosters because the Cincinnati defense is going to be so popular. And it actually makes some sense. Like if Dallas loses Dak Prescott, like maybe this is the time they want. Ezekiel Elliott's got to go out and earn that money. And so, they just keep running. And again, like, it doesn't necessarily need to work out. Like, the Bengals could still win, and maybe Dallas just scores 14 points. But I think that's lower than their implied point total, would be 14 points. And still, if Dallas is just running the ball and Cincinnati's not getting interceptions, they're not getting sacks, they could still win like 28-14 and put up like 3 points from their defense.
I very easily see a path where Dallas scores 17, the Bengals get, which is what? You get one defense special teams point from that. The Bengals get 2 sacks and 1 turnover, and they're sitting at 5 points. If the Bengals don't just totally run away with this game, we're not going to see the Cowboys call on Cooper Rush to drop back 35, 40 times. And so as long as this game stays relatively close, I think that we'll see them calling kind of shorter, safer passes, get the ball to guys in their hands in space, get the ball to Zeke on the ground. And I really like the idea of hunting for some leverage off of that Bengals defense. So you talked about Zeke. I've thought about Noah Brown this week, right? 9 targets last week. He's probably going to see 6, 7, 8 targets. He's 3,800. He doesn't kill your roster if he only puts up 8 or 9 points. But if he puts up 5 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown, you're sitting on 17 points. Everybody else has Greg Dortch, and you probably outscored those Dortch rosters. You've hurt the Bengals rosters. And he doesn't kill you if he puts up 6, 7, 8 points, right? And so finding a way to not just say, I don't want to bet on the Bengals defense, but to also say, I want to try to capture what could happen if people are wrong on the Bengals defense. And you don't have to do that because, like we just said, it could just be the Bengals still have a good game, but they only get 5, 6 defense special teams points because that's just the nature of how defense special teams works. You really want like, Buccaneers against Jameis, and Jameis is throwing the ball 55 times, and the Bucs get 6 sacks and 2 picks, and all of a sudden, they run one back for a touchdown, and that's the defense you had to have. Look for these spots where guys are passing a lot because that's where mistakes end up happening.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, like we don't get points for theory, right? For oh, well, this defense did really well this game. Like, no, there's specific things that have to happen for you to get DFS points for the defense. It has to be like turnovers, sacks, and touchdowns, which are generally coming from turnovers and sacks. And so, if they're going to run the ball, and like, maybe they're just going to keep running the ball and they're not going to put it in Cooper Rush's hands. And if they lose the game, they're just not going to get embarrassed, right? There's so many ways that the Bengals defense or any defense can fail that if, I would be surprised if I use the Bengals defense in a single entry format, or even like if it's a 5 entry, maybe I'm going to have like one Bengals defense, or maybe not. Just because you can see they're going to be so popular because of the narrative of like the backup quarterback going in. But this is not some rookie going into the snow and ice, to play his first NFL game. Like I think he won a game week 8 last year against Minnesota. I think the Bengals defense will be overwhelmed. And I'm going to try to
and produced 100 plus yards for Amari and 100 plus yards for CeeDee Lamb in that spot. I mean, we don't expect him to be a great quarterback while he's filling in, but he can certainly produce production. He can certainly have games where the opposing defense doesn't just blow up for a huge game. And that's, I think, like you said, this is an interesting week where chalk is going to congregate so heavily. And a lot of them are good chalk. Devontae Adams is good chalk in terms of he's still a great play. Saquon's good chalk in terms of he's still a great play. The Bengals, like, defense special team scoring is so highly variable that the Bengals are, like, by any measure, the best projected defense on the slate. And yet it's by like fractions above other defenses, and their ownership is so far above other defenses that it's easy to say, well, I can take the second highest projected defense, the third, fourth highest projected defense. I'm not losing any particular points. I remember when I first got into MLB DFS, and I would read Notorious's Grind Down, and he would always mention, like, this team is 19th in this, right? Or this team is 8th in this. And I would always go check to be like, what's that gap between this team being 19th and actually being 10th, because a lot of times that gap is so tiny that it really doesn't matter as much as people will credit it, right? If you read this team is 10th in this, then you're like, ooh, that's pretty good. If you read 19th, you're like, they're not that good. But if the difference is tiny, it doesn't matter. And it's kind of like that with defense special teams, right? If we can find those little places where everybody's like, oh, this is the best defense on the week. And you're like, yeah, but at 40% ownership compared to this other defense, it's just like predicted fractionally below them at a position that's highly like high variance, we can gain a lot of an edge just from saying, okay, cool, I'll go a different direction here.
Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting week to see the ownership projections, because we say before the season starts, like, well, week 2, week 3, week 4, those are the weeks where everybody feels overconfident. And I think with some of the pricing, especially on DraftKings and on FanDuel as well, like we're going to see some really large ownerships on the Bengals defense, on David Carr, on Devontae Adams. And out of those 3, I think, probably Devontae would be the guy that I'd most want to have. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see how week 2 shapes up. JM, any closing thoughts?
No, you can fit Devontae and Cup on some rosters together too. So that's something to play around with. But that's a unique way to get that Devontae exposure. But no, nothing else for me. I love picking your brain. I'm glad we got to get to some slate specific stuff today, because I think that as we're getting into the season, that's super valuable for me. Hopefully it's valuable for you and valuable for listeners for sure, to kind of talk through some of the unique situations for this week's slate for single entry. And we also, I think, got to some good strategy and theory on single entry as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we at least touched on all the positions this week. So hopefully week 2 goes well. That'll do it for the single entry solo ship strategy show.
Solo ship.
And yeah, thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you all next week.